academician and current head of Department of History, University of Delhi. Her research of interests focus on the history of South Asian art, ancient Indian art, and iconography, Western Himalayan art and religion, modern and contemporary Indian art. Currently, she is working on Gupta and post-Gupta Saivism in northern India. Her international recognition is evident through the prestigious Daud Fellowship received to study at University of Bonn and Golden Brush Award for contribution to art conferred by FMG Institute. Her notable publications include Gods, Men and Women, Gender and Sexuality in Early Indian Art and Religion and Art of Chamba Valley, 700 to 1300 AD. She has edited very famous book, Locating Pleasure in Indian History, Prescribed and Proscribed Desire in Visual and Literary Cultures. Having lectured at esteemed institutions such as the Institute of Archaeology, the National Museum, and Indian Habitat Center, Professor Ma'am brings a wealth of experience as a speaker. Her research paper on early Indian sculptures and architecture have been published in reputed journals. We sincerely invite Ma'am to deliver the talk on historiography of visual culture. Her presence would elevate the academic discourse and provide valuable perspectives to our scholars. Please, ma'am.
Just two things. One, that I'm no longer the head of the department. I
Okay, ma'am.
finished my term, so I'm no longer head. Secondly, if you could tell me 1 hour for speaking and half an hour for questions. What is the format here? Or 1 hour?
I think, ma'am, 1 hour lecture, 1 hour, I think half hours
Question.
questions.
All right, fine. Thank you. Thank you so much. So basically, what I am focusing on today is visual culture and visual sources and the historiography thereof. Why do I choose this? One, of course, is because I am a art historian and a historian. I'm trained in both. So I'm interested in both kinds of sources and their interaction. So that is why I want to do this. Just a minute. Just give me 1 minute. Huh?
Okay, ma'am. Depend on you, ma'am. I think historiography of visual culture, your topic, but depend on you.
So basically, what happens is that we all think of history in terms of sources which are literary, which are in terms of, say, coins and inscriptions and stuff like that. But in fact, the first interest in the history of India was garnered by the visual culture of India. So when and this has been documented very well by Partha Mittar, whose book I am particularly recommending to you, The Much Maligned Monsters. Please do have a look at it. That I think will help you understand the early encounters of Europeans with Indian art. It is not that Indians were not aware of art before this. There were many shastras that were composed around the creation and production of artifacts and art such as sculpture, painting, architecture, a corpus which is called the Shilpa Shastras and the Vastu Shastras. So we have the Shilpa and the Vastu Shastras as normative traditions in the production of art, which give us norms, rules, um, prescriptions, regulations about the making of icons, temples, palaces, so on and so forth. We have and how to paint. What are the Shadanga theory of painting, which is the 6 elements or the 6 limbs of painting, including shading, coloring, creating an outline, so on and so forth. Now, these particular Shilpa and Vastu Shastras started being composed around the late 7th century, and the first extant Vastu Shastra that we have, or Shilpa Shastra that we have, is known as the Vishnu Dharmottar Purana, the third part of which deals with this particular aspect, and it was written in Kashmir. But all through till very recently, Shilpa Shastras continued to be composed in almost all regions, and they are very region specific. So you have the Oriental Shilpa Shastras such as the Shilpa Prakash. You have the Central Indian Shilpa Shastras such as the Samrangan Sutradhar. You have the South Indian Shilpa Shastras such as Manolas. You have the Gujarati and the Western Indian Shilpa Shastras such as the Shirnava. So there are a number of these regional traditions that are being accommodated in the prescriptive part of writing. However, these are things that were meant for the practitioners and patrons of art, right? They were meant not as instruction manuals, but a broad kind of some were instruction manuals, some were broad prescriptions that were given about the ideal icon, the ideal temple, the ideal palace, the ideal road, and so on, the town, and so on and so forth. The second more important thing that I find about the Shilpa Shastras is that it gives us a vision about how a particular object should be considered. Now, these are separate body of knowledge which are part of what are known as the 14 Vidyasthals, which make up the Indian Sanskrit tradition, which includes the Vedas, the Puranas, the astrological and astronomical writings, and the Shilpa Shastras, anything to do with knowledge, Vidyasthals. This has been extensively studied by scholars both in India and in Europe. So we do have a very strong tradition of trying to understand these knowledge traditions separately and together. I would like to emphasize that in Indian art, and this I cannot say strongly enough, in Indian art, there is very little separation between art and craft. So Kala or Shilpa are often used interchangeably. It is not as if a Kala, 64 Kala, we hear of the 64 arts. Now, many of these 64 arts are actually crafts. For example, garlanding, creating a garland. Now, this is not a particular art, it is a craft, or making perfume. Now, these are considered crafts. Painting is also one such activity. So this distinction between, which is a very Western notion of a distinction between something that belongs to an artist's particular genius, right? And something that is repetitive. This kind of a distinction is not there in the Indian artistic tradition, right? And this, I think, is an important aspect which we have to keep in mind, because we are also talking about this is why we will be discussing in the historiography what the Western attitudes towards Indian art were. Secondly, the art was not created for art's sake. That is, art was not created to revel in the artistic genius. ऐसा नहीं है कि भाई कोई कला बना रहा है और सब लोग कह रहे हैं कि क्या कलाकार है, कहते होंगे. I'm not saying that this was not something that was happening. But this was not the primary reason why art was being created. Art or architecture was being created as an offering. It was an offering to the deity. It was an offering by whichever patron it was. It would be something that was also something that had a sacred kind of or a ritual, a votive, sacred, or a ritual purpose. So this was not something that was meant to showcase an artist's genius. There are times when an artist does put down his name, and actually in Chalukyan art, for example, we do have the artist making some kind of a statement about his own artistry, right? So that of course this happens, but that is something that is rare. It's very rare to find somebody like Phaedius, for example. In Indian art, we have an example of a patron-artist relationship from Chamba, where a ruler called Meruvarman had patronized an artist called Gugga, and they together, created 4 remarkable brass icons in the Chamba Bharmor region. However, these are rare, where you say these kind of a combination of a patron and an artist, both of whose names are carved or inscribed on these pedestals or on the walls of temples. At Aihole, Badami, we are finding some examples. So it's not as if there's complete anonymity. There are Shilp Prakash, for example, is very, very important for, and so are very, very many other texts where you are getting examples of an artist or a sthapati or a sutradhar's name, but it's not a norm. It's not there everywhere. Okay, having said that, this anonymity and the fact that art is not for art's sake in India is an important aspect that I would like you to keep in mind. The third important part, which is something that I've been working on recently, is that art is, or sculpture, for example, is not a separate activity, right? Sculpture, painting, music, dance, drama, architecture, these are all considered to be interconnected. So knowledge of drama required a knowledge of painting and vice versa, because it was considered that these are all born out of the gods, so to speak. So painting was born out of Vishnu. Dance was born out of dance, drama, etc., are born out of Shiva. Similarly, all of the music, these are all born out of God. So they are not separate activities. You need the artist as well as the viewer needs to know all these. Okay. Now, this is one layer of what is happening in terms of writing about Indian art. But this, as I've already said, is something that is meant for practitioners and for the patrons and also for the viewers or the audience. This is not something that gives us a history. So while these are all saying that I am borrowing or I am from the tradition of Vishwakarma, this is not a historical tradition. We don't know which Vishwakarma this is being traced back to. And though, of course, this means that they are all invoking a previous tradition. Right? And this is something that's happening in all Shastras. It's not that it's just happening in the Shilpa and the Vastu Shastras. The invocation of what has been called embedded histories or an invocation of invoking a tradition that is long past is something that is happening everywhere. So whether it is the Markandeya Puran or the Agni Puran or the Vishnu Dharmottar Puran or even the Brihat Samhita or Varaha Mira, Samrangan Sutradhar of Raja Bhoj. Now, all of these are saying that we are basing ourselves on a long-standing tradition of sages coming down from the sages and the seers and the rishis and the gods who have revealed this to us. This was not considered to be history, right? This is considered to be a source. What happens when you start to systemize and write about art or Indian art or South Asian art, to be more precise? And why is it important? Right. Now, my particular viewpoint is that given that literacy may have been limited, right, till the colonial and the post-colonial period, visual sources were readily available. So even if you have inscriptions and you have literary sources, which were very much in circulation, we know that they were in circulation. It's not that, even in Maza Pravas, it says that, when this gentleman went to Jhansi and on the way back, he is disputing with local Brahmins on various issues based on the circulation of textual and literary traditions. However, I think that it is important to understand that the first encounter with the culture was probably visual. When people went from one place to another, they were encountering architecture, they were encountering icons, they were encountering statues, they were encountering paintings, so on and so forth. And this really was defining that cultural space. And also, very readily, this kind of distinction was available where it was possible to say, when you moved, say, for example, from East India to West India, you were encountering at least three major temple building styles. So you could say, okay, this area is that of the Eastern Gangas, this is of the Geherwalas, this is of the Chandelas or the Paramaras or whatever, and this is of the Solankis, because the style of temples, though the main thing was the same, the style was changing, right? So the encounter of anybody who was going through these areas was with this visual culture. So visual culture in itself is becoming an important aspect of cultural and regional and political identities. Given this, I think it is important that we start giving importance to visual sources and trying to understand their history. And this is something that I think that early historians understood very well. Why do I say this? I say this because when the Europeans came, right, the first encounters that they also had was with the temples and the icons and so on and so forth. And the first encounter was, I would say, was that of misunderstanding. For the sake of simplicity, let's just make it something called misunderstanding, because I'm not going into the Orientalists per se at the moment. I will do Orientalists a little later. But when the Europeans came and they saw these very large temples, whether in South India or elsewhere, and they saw these gods and icons which were very foreign to them because they were coming from a monolithic Christian tradition. Of course, there are sects and so on and so forth, but was a Christian tradition where there was monotheism, one God, saints, apostles, so on and so forth, and a particular iconography which was based on the Christian belief that God made man in his own image, right? So the gods that they were encountering, or the saints that they were encountering, though had an iconography, so we could make out Saint Peter from Saint Paul, they were in the image of man, right? So this was an important thing because God was being imagined as man. When we come to India, they are encountering gods who have 3 eyes, 4 heads, 20 arms, and so multiplicity of organs, of heads, of arms is something that they are completely baffled by. That how can this be a god? So that is one particular aspect why they called it these monsters, right? The other thing was that they were encountering gods who were grotesque by their definition. So, for example, wearing skull necklaces made of skulls, or carrying skulls as their receptacles, as in Bhikshatan Murti, for example, or Kali. So remember that their first encounters are either in South India or in Bengal. So Kali becomes very important, where you have a goddess who is ferocious. She has a tongue hanging out. She's wearing whatever of skull. She's got 20 hands. She's dancing on a corpse and so on and so forth. Now, when they're encountering these, what is their reaction? Their first reaction is of disgust, of actually having this feeling that these are not gods, right? These are monsters. So this first encounter of the Westerners with Indian art created a tradition, okay, of looking at India and its cultural production in terms of visual culture as being superstitious, backward, unreasonable, illogical, and therefore lowly in the evolutionary scheme. Because remember, in the post-Enlightenment period, there is and especially from Hegel onwards, there is this idea of progression, of civilizational progression, where capitalism and modernity are logic, science. These are the things that are being admired. And Indian art and architecture, as they saw it, does not come up to the standards of European art. Now, this basis of the first encounter of the odd and the illogical and so on and so forth is what informs the colonial historiography on Indian art and architecture, which is going to be now my main theme, right, of this particular subtopic. I will go on to national and then spiritual, but I will be talking a little bit about these early historians. Now, why is there so much of writing on Indian art and architecture happening, right? Remember, and I'm going to link it to two institutional. You'll just have to excuse me 1 minute. Huh? Apologies. This is what happens when you take a class or a lecture from home. Right. So I'm sure you've all encountered it. I was talking about colonial historiography. So one is, let's just make it into two parts to make it an easier kind of to make it easy for you. One part is that there is an antiquarian interest, right? And the other is institutional. What is an antiquarian? I'm sure since all of you are lecturers, you're very aware of these early developments. So I will not go very much into it. But when the European travelers, officials, traders are moving around, right? And remember, they are very mobile, right? Their entire jobs are very mobile. They're usually, going from one district to another. They're administering districts and so on and so forth. So when they are going, they are coming across these antiquities. These antiquities could be temples, they could be caves, they could be inscriptions, they could be icons or religious artifacts, okay, or non-religious artifacts. They could be palaces and so on and so forth. This interests them, right? Because this is part of one, their own training as which was mainly in liberal arts. Philosophy was a major subject, classical languages was a major subject for them when they were coming, when they were studying. So these were subjects that they were taught. So when they come to India and South Asia, these are interests that they bring along with them, because they've learned Greek, they've learned Latin, so they're interested, they know about and they're rather familiar with the classical cultures of Greece and Rome and so on and so forth. Now, using that experience, they try to retrieve and understand the antiquities of India. This leads to one, collection, and two, documentation. So we know that they are collecting a lot of Indian art, which leads to an extent to loot of Indian antiquities and architecture, such as that of the Amravati, which we've heard very much about. And, books have been written about how the pillaging of sites such as Amravati, or pillaging of sites such as Sanchi, Bharut, and so on and so forth. The other and most important one is of documentation. So they're writing about what they are encountering for themselves and also for their peers. So it's not like they're sending these dispatches back to England. Some of them are also illustrating this, and you have an entire colonial school coming up around the picturesque and the romantic movement, which is important in Europe during this time, where ruins and antiquities are something that interests them very much. So you have the Hodges, William Hodges, you have a lot of travelers who are coming in, sketching, etching, and publishing these for the curious public who want to know more about this jewel in the crown, India. The other important aspect is institutional, right? So very soon, this kind of an antiquarian interest becomes institutionalized. First, in the Royal Asiatic Society, which we all have heard of, William Jones, and so on and so forth. In the late 18th century, you have people who are now documenting it not just randomly, but are actually focusing this and sending their dispatches to be published in a proper journal called Royal Asiatic Society Journal of Letters, Arts and Crafts, and so on and so forth. Now, this is very important because this leads to not just documentation, but a dialogue, okay, between each other. So incremental knowledge. So and so say so and so he's discovered so and such a such thing, and so on and so forth. So this institutionalization of visual artifacts, okay, is something that I find important. The other, which happens in the middle of the 19th century, is a remarkable institution, which is the Archaeological Survey of India, which was, as you know, founded by this engineer, Sir Alexander Cunningham. And Sir Alexander Cunningham, for 30 years or more, surveyed this entire north and central India, parts of eastern and the Deccan area, and documented almost all important monuments that he discovered, found, and wrote about. So these diaries that he maintained, which are now available, which were available forever, are very important documents for us about the early histories of this. Now, these two institutions, the Royal Asiatic Society and the Archaeological Survey of India, are very important for the historiography of Indian art and architecture because they form the basis of information that gave us a outline of chronology and style. Okay. Now, why I am saying this, and I will come back to this, is that remember that many of Indian chronologies and dynasties and knowledge is based on visual artifacts. You know, they're based on things like we know about Ashok because of the pillars and the shillalekh, the rock inscriptions that and the minor edicts, major and minor edicts that were discovered. Right? We know about Kushanas due to their coins and the inscriptions and the visual artifacts that we've discovered. Similarly, history of early Buddhism beyond the canonical literature is based on the stupas of Bharut, Sanchi, Amravati, Koshambi, and so on and so forth. So the importance of the visual language for the writing of history, especially during the colonial period, has to be acknowledged and has to be kept in mind that a lot of what was happening was of writing history was interdependent. And this interdependence is something that I would very much like you to to consider and also to emulate if possible, because this kind of interdependence between sources is something that really helped create a grand narrative. Now, while Alexander Cunningham was surveying, one of the major sources that he was using was, just a minute. Sorry. So, as I was saying, that one of the major sources that Alexander Cunningham was using was the Huon Sang's travels in the Western Kingdom. So he was saying, okay, so many kilometers west of Varanasi is this particular site. So Sahet Mahet or Shravasti, for example. So now this kind of an interdependence for discovery is very much part of the early historiography of documentation and discovery. However, I'm just going to come to the next point, which is about attitudes and perspectives, which is also an important aspect of colonial history writing on Indian art. As I've said, that, and I will, of course, just a minute. I will be reading out certain passages to you, if with your permission. And I think these are important passages which tell us a lot about the attitudes towards Indian art that these particular these just give me 1 minute. Huh? I had opened this particular document, but I can't find it now. So I will. All right. So what I am just going to read them out so that one understands how this is reflecting the attitude of Europeans towards Indian history and Indian visual culture. All right. The first and most important is James Mill, right? So I'm not saying that colonial responses to Indian art are linear or simplistic. There are a multitude of tropes of reading Western responses to Indian art and culture that contend with each other. On one hand, the Europeans bracket Indians as passive and effeminate people, and there are a lot of levels to this amongst the ruling and the official elite. There is a very partial, or not partial by, I mean biased, knowledge production and reproduction in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And we have three major trends coming up. One is of Orientalists, one is another of Anglicists, and the third is of utilitarians. And this has been studied by many historians, where Anglican and the Anglicists, who were emphasizing the superiority of Western Christian I like to say, systems of visual production in terms of sculpture or in churches, in monasteries, and so on and so forth, was being privileged and admired. The Orientalists were saying, no, India is a very old civilization. Its monuments, so on and so forth, are beautiful and they need to be studied. And utilitarians were, of course, looking at and judging Indian art by the standards of whether they were useful or not. Okay. While the Orientalists were romanticizing the classical Indian tradition and the spiritual past, the Anglicists were not looking at it as rational, as Western or modern. They were saying that these are all very old and superstitious, for something that we've talked about. The utilitarians were looking at industrial and mechanical West as more superior to the non-monolithic tradition in India. And this was based on the imperialist and racist theories that were being fashioned and developed and deployed by these early commentators. So their exegesis impelled further theorization on the ascendancy of colonial metropolis over the okay. So that they were like kind of saying that the metropolis was more important than the imperial dominions. Okay. Now, James Mill, we already know about, who wrote the very influential History of British India, which was being used in Haileybury College to train colonial civil servants who came down to India to administer and rule, and therefore it has some salience. So he said that architecture, weaving, and jewelry are the only art for which Hindus have been celebrated. And even these, with the exception of weaving, remained in a low state of improvement. So basically saying that Indians, know only weaving. He further goes on to say, of the Hindus, it may first of all be observed that they little courted the pleasure derived from the art. So Hindus didn't like art, or Indians were not. And whatever the skill they had attended in them, the houses, even of the great, were mean and almost destitute. Sonnerath goes on to say that the architecture of the Hindu is very rude and the structures in honor of their deities are venerable only from their magnitude. Mill further says the general eulogy bestowed upon the ornament, they're almost entirely without significance. Now, even somebody like Alexander Cunningham, whose work I've just talked about, that when he starts documenting and systemizing this body of knowledge, what he is saying is that he's giving them names like Indo-Grecian, Indo-Sasanian. So basically saying that there is whatever good is there about Indian art, it is derived from the West. It could be Scythians, it could be Parthians, it could be Greeks, it could be Sasanians. So this kind of an attitude is there. Now, next we come to very, very important person called James Ferguson. Many of you would have heard of him. Now, he wrote the History of Indian Architecture. He was one of the first ones to look at thousands. He was an indigo planter. So he was, this was the time when photography had come into being, right? So given that this gave him a documentation, right, of many, many monuments. He used these to create a history of style and chronology of architecture. This is one of the first systematic approaches to creating a history of Indian art and architecture. And most of what he said is being used today. You know, कि पहले मौर्यन आए, उसके बाद फिर कुषाण, whatever आए, शुंग आए, फिर कुषाण आए, फिर गुप्त आए, and so on and so forth. That kind of a chronology, though sometimes it's been changed given new information, but for the longest time, that chronology was of great salience to understanding Indian history. This is especially important because Indian textual tradition is not very precisely datable. Using inscriptions and using a stylistic analysis of art and architecture, he was able to give a chronology or a time frame to Indian history, especially of visual cultures. And this, I think, is important moment in the historiography of visual culture. Given his importance, I think it is important to understand what his attitude towards Indian art and architecture was. He retained a firm conviction in the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon over the Asiatic, leading to a particular kind of a blindness. In spite of his sympathetic views on Indian art, he notes in the preface of his first edition, History of Indian and Eastern Architecture, and I quote, "In such a country as India, the chisels of a sculptors are, as so far as I can judge, immeasurably more to be trusted than the pens of our authors." However, he goes on to note, for certain qualities, the Indian buildings are unrivaled. They display an exuberance, fancy, a lavishness of art. The Indian buildings stand alone. It cannot be contended that India ever reached the intellectual supremacy of Greece or the moral greatness of Rome. Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello? Now you can hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. So basically, what I was saying was that the Europeans were not using the Indian sources at all. When Ramras comes and starts analyzing, especially Ellora he was from Hyderabad, so starts exploring these areas. He comes, he starts using the Indian Shilpa Shastras, what I had started with, and that is why I started with that. And till Ramras starts doing this, the terms that were being used to describe Indian architecture were Western. So you had the Doric arch, the Ionic pillar, you have tympanums, you have eaves, so and so forth. Instead of chhajjas uh, and shikhars, so they were called pyramids or they were called pagodas. There was a complete Europeanization of the vocabulary of Indian art and architecture. This changes with the intervention of two great historians of Indian art, Ramras and Rajendra Lal Mitra, both of whom are now interested. Of course, it's not like they're only studying architecture, they were doing many other things about an history. But what their seminal contribution was to bring Indian vocabulary into and Indian ways of looking and understanding the tradition into the into the history or the historiography of Indian art and architecture. Since I have very little time, I will not go into more colonialism and colonial and imperial frameworks. So this is also the beginning of the nationalization of the history of Indian art and architecture. And I will only discuss three great names because, for the lack of time. What is happening is that on one hand, there is compensatory history writing, which you must have done in other courses. Compensatory history writing is कि तुम्हारे पास है तो हमारे पास भी है ना. तुम्हारे पास अगर पार्थेनॉन है तो हमारे पास थंजावर है. So that kind of a competitive compensatory history writing is happening, where they are saying that if you have this, we have this, right? The other, and I think far more important thing that is happening is that they are now extracting Indian art and architecture from the Western and the European context and placing it and embedding it into the Indian context. So the national project, of course, the nationalism project, so to speak, is to not only emphasize the greatness of Indian civilization, but also its unique qualities. And very many things that the Europeans were using in order to denigrate Indian civilization as effeminate, weak, superstitious, backward, so on and so forth, were now being explained by the nationalist historians in Indian terms. So, like, for example, you have somebody like Altikar, who goes on to explain the status of women, saying that women had a lot of, were empowered in the ancient period and became disempowered with the invasions, so and so forth. There is also this kind of history writing that's happening about Indian art. So while Vincent Smith is saying that there is nudity, right, and there is obscenity about Indian art, by this time Khajuraho had been discovered, right? So you have Mathura and you have Khajuraho and you have Orissa, Puri, and Modhera. These have all been discovered and been studied. So this kind of sanity about the Indian women, womanhood, body, all these have come into the discourse of Indian art. So while Vincent Smith and others are actually decrying the presence of these, the nationalists are saying that, excuse me, these are not to be condemned. They have to be read within the very important element of fertility. These should be read within the discourse of fertility, because nudity is not just nudity. It's not obscene. Nudity, if it is there, or if any of there is sexuality, this is because it is about fertility. It is about fecundity. It is about motherhood, especially motherhood in Indian art. So this kind of a attitude is also being discussed. Then you have origins. One important aspect is origins of Indian art. So unlike the colonial historiography, which is looking at the origins of Indian art in the West, in Greece, in Sasanian art, these writers are saying, no, we do have a history of Indian art which can be traced from the ancient, very ancient roots, and predates the Greeks, and therefore we must read Indian art in its own terms. I'll give you an example of the Buddha, right? So for the longest period in the Barut and Sachi and so on, Buddha is not shown in his bodily form, right? Because there's a Hinayan tradition. It was said by the Westerners such as Foucher and by Al Cunningham and so on and so forth. It was basically being said that the Buddha image is not there because you didn't know how to make images, right? आपको तो आता ही नहीं था. जब ग्रीक आए और अपने गॉड्स लेकर आए तो आपको समझ में आया कि कैसे बनाते हैं. So, they were basically saying that the genius, the idea of creating a deity comes with the Greek. Therefore, the Buddha image should be traced to the presence of the Greeks in northwestern India and Gandhar art. People like Kumaraswamy, I'm sure you've heard of Ananda Kentish Kumaraswamy, a Sri Lankan French historian of Indian art, classicist, great classicist. He said that no, and others like V.S. Agarwala, who, if time permits, I will like to talk about. Now, basically what he's saying is that no, that's not true. Look at the Yaksha images. Yaksha images which predate and can be dated to the Mauryan period are the prototypes. They are the ones that are being used as models for creating the Buddha image, and we must not get bogged down by the idea of the Western influence. So this is one aspect. And very quickly, in last 5 minutes, so that I have more questions that I can answer, last 5 minutes, I'll just talk about, spiritual, the spiritual basis of Indian art, which is an offshoot of national historiography. People like Kumaraswamy and Stella Crambrish were the ones who said that we must read Indian art in its spiritual context, right? We must look at Indian art in its symbolic and spiritual context. So the Indian temple, for example, Stella Crambrish read the Indian temple in her 1957, I think, 2 volumes, as symbolic. It symbolizes a Vedic ritual, it symbolizes the primordial man, it symbolizes the original sacrifice of the primordial man, and so on and so forth. So basically, this becomes a very important aspect of reading Indian art in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. One major thrust is also at identification, right? Of identifying certain objects and saying what was identified by the colonials needs to be reread and inscribed. Identities need to be reinscribed. The last 50 years have seen some major trends in which echo the trends in history writing, uh, mainstream history writing, so to speak, in terms of art and architecture. So we have social history of art, we have gendered history of art, we have environmental history of art. Landscapes have become very important in understanding art and architecture and how they are placed in particular contexts. So these kind of things have also been explored. And I think I've given you a very brief, very, very brief outline of how visual sources are becoming important in reading Indian histories, especially given that if we were to say that 2000s were when history took a cultural turn, then I would say 2020s is when history takes a visual turn, where visual sources have become very important for understanding and reading and contextualizing histories, especially, uh, you know, integrating them into mainstream history writings, whether it is in textbooks or it is in other, where thematic based histories, where visual sources are being used more and more to create a more complete picture. But because very often the information that you get from visual sources may not agree with that of literary sources. So it's giving you an alternate vision also. So I think I will leave you here. And next time I'll talk about methodologies as to how do we actually read and use visual sources. Thank you so much. So if you have questions, please. Anybody with questions? नहीं तो जल्दी छुट्टी हो जाएगी.
So you are not audible.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, you are.
Ma'am, is it so that compared to Hinayana Buddhism, that Mahayana Buddhism had encouraged art and architecture? Is it so, ma'am? Can you please elaborate that?
Okay. It's not that Mahayana Buddhism encourages art and architecture. Hinayan Buddhism also had art and architecture, Bharhut, Sanchi, parts of the first phase of Amravati, Kaushambi. So you have a lot of early, and then Theravada in Sri Lanka. But the change that is happening is in the representation of the Buddha and the Bodhisattva, which was not there in which was not there in the Hinayan or the Theravada phase. So much more production of the Buddha, the figure of Buddha in his anthropomorphic form, and of a being or a kind of figure called Bodhisattva, Buddha to be made, such as Maitreya, Amitabha, Avalokiteshvara, and so on and so forth. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, ma'am.
Yeah, tell me.
My question is, you have said about uh, scriptures deities after the Greeks, but we have found the deity sculptures या statue is worship in Harappan civilization in the Indian continent. But how you
I think
have
you
after Greeks in Indian continent starting the statue worship, but the Harappan culture, the Lord Shiva and dancing girls and the other deities, yeah, scriptures, yeah, statues are found.
I think that you misunderstood what I said. I said that colonial historiography said this. People like Alfred Foucher, Alexander Cunningham, even Mortimer Wheeler, these were the people who were saying this. This was not, this was contested by nationalist historians such as Kumaraswamy and V.S. Agarwala, who said no, that the origins of Indian iconography should be seen in Indian history. You know, at that time, they were not considering Harappa to be a source because Harappa was not, or Harappan civilization was not so extensively studied and excavated. Some of it was, not very much. But they were looking at yakshas, the Didarganj Yakshi, the Parkham Yaksha from Mathura, Baroda, Patna, and Guddimallam. The Guddimallam from Andhra Pradesh, which was Guddimallam is a Mukhalinga, kind of a Mukhalinga, which was being considered as a source. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that this is what we agree with. We don't agree with it. We don't say that the Greeks brought image worship to India. I'm saying that colonial historians said that they did, right? So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Anybody else? No? Dr. Aftab? If there are no more questions, I think we can end the meeting. You're on mute. आप म्यूट में हैं.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, you are on mute.